So you heard that. We're recording the meeting. There are people who want to hear this who couldn't make it tonight. So we're going to post the link to the YouTube recording on the Clean Air Action Network website and our DSA Facebook page so that people can hear what you guys have to say. So we're beginning now. I think I want to get rid of this. How do I get rid of the? Yeah, there we go. I think no. All right, so continue. So Molly, I can't get rid of this recording.
You gotta touch.
Oh, just push it. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, my name is Paul Hancock, and I'll be the moderator of this panel discussion. Is incineration good for the future of Hudson Falls? I want to thank Bill Nickus for graciously allowing us to use this beautiful facility at the newly renovated Sandy Hill Arts Center on Main Street in Hudson Falls. It's important to mention that this land where we're gathered tonight is the territory of the Mohican people who inhabited this area for generations prior to the arrival of Europeans. We want to thank the sponsors of tonight's discussion, the Clean Air Action Network of Glens Falls and the Southern Adirondack Democratic Socialists of America, a branch of the Capital District DSA. I believe we have a petition and sign up contact information for both these organizations posted online. Now will be soon, and here in the room for those people gathered in person. We also have refreshments, unfortunately not for the speakers, but to those in attendance at the Sandy Hill Arts Center. My colleague Molly Pearl will be handling the YouTube streaming of this event, which will be recorded and available online at the Clean Air Action Network's website, cleanairactionnetwork.org, and the Facebook page, as well as on the Southern Adirondack DSA's Facebook page. The panelists, which I will give brief bios in order of appearance, is Anna Baptista, who is an assistant professor of professional practice in, this is dark here, by the way, in the Tishman Environmental and Sustainable, the graduate program at the Milano School of Public Management and Environment. She also serves as the associate director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. Anna's research and professional practice focuses on environmental and climate justice. She works directly with EJ organizations and coalitions to support the advancement of environmental justice. I had more, but I will leave it at that. Adrian Perovich has a master's in public administration from the New School and is associate director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School in New York City. Adrian supports the research of the Tishman Center, which co-produces transdisciplinary participatory research and initiatives with environmental justice partners across the country. She contributed to the report entitled U.S. Municipal Solid Waste Incineration, a Failing Industry. David Carpenter is professor of environmental health sciences of the SUNY campus of the University of Albany, where he is the director of the Institute for Health and the Environment. Dr. Carpenter's research is focused on the study of environmental causes of human disease. He has studied rates of hospitalization for diabetes, hypertension, thyroid disease, cardiovascular, and neurodegenerative diseases in relation to living near hazardous waste sites. I'll leave it at that. Fred Magdoff is Professor Emeritus of Plant and Soil Science at the University of Vermont. His books include Agriculture, Food and Crisis, Conflict Resistance and Renewal, co-authored with Brian Tokar, what every environmentalist needs to know about capitalism, with John Bellamy Foster, his latest book, Creating an Ecological Society Toward a Revolutionary Transformation, with Chris Williams. His research interests range from soil science to agriculture and food, to the environment, to the US economy. Please welcome our panelists, if people can hear. There's tremendous applause on this side, by the way. Each panelist will have 15 minutes for their remarks, which may range from direct discussion of the incinerator and alternatives to it, the health effects of its emissions, and to a deeper understanding of how solutions to problems in a market society are found. The notion that a more profound transformation may be required. I think we're going to enjoy this, by the way. At the end of the panelist remarks, we will have an opportunity for questions. Please pass your written questions through the chat room if you're online, or by note card if you are in the room. We have note cards somewhere over here. This is our first hybrid meeting, so please have patience with us, bear with us. Thanks so much for your attendance. And with that, I will turn it over to Anna and Adrian.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you for inviting us for this conversation. And we are very happy to be able to share some of our research. And I'll just mention that the research report we're going to talk about some of the findings we did was commissioned by a group called the Global Alliance for Incineration Alternatives, GAIA. And it was really a part of a broader advocacy campaign with 6 communities across the country who host incinerators in their backyards and have been really opposing these facilities for many years. And so it was really in support of their work that we set out to kind of do a more comprehensive landscape assessment of this industry, to really highlight what many environmental justice communities know and have lived in terms of what it's like to live in the shadow of these facilities. And also hopefully to promote thinking about what's next, what comes after these incinerators are no longer viable and can be, go to the next thing, which is really talking about zero waste systems. And many of these communities are looking to replace these incinerators with zero waste infrastructure. So we're going to share a little bit about the report with you, and happy to answer questions from the audience for more in-depth details on them. We looked at at the time when we started the report, there were 73 municipal solid waste incinerators in the country. There are now 71, although there will be soon there'll be 70 because there's another plant closure slated for June 2022 in Connecticut. And one that closed in Florida in 2021. So they are, many of these facilities, what we found, are reaching the end of their life expectancy. They're built in the early 1990s, 1980s. They're typically supposed to, be able to operate for 20 to 30 years. So it's not surprising that we see the closure of many of these plants. What our report particularly looked at was sort of the economic model underlying these facilities and also their relationship to environmental justice communities. And what we found was a pattern in which most of these facilities, over 80% of them, are located in communities of color and low income communities, which is how we define environmental justice communities. We found most of them, of course, are at the end of their life expectancy. We looked at their economic model in terms of what it takes to operate and maintain an aging facility, like an incinerator. We looked at the revenue model and how these facilities, although they talk about themselves and have rebranded themselves as waste to energy, how they're really reliant on revenue streams from waste. There's primarily just waste facilities. And the increasing attention to zero waste by communities and the opposition to these facilities, as well as climate change, is putting pressure on these facilities as well. And we also looked a little bit at the health implications of the co-location of these facilities in vulnerable and susceptible communities and the kinds of potential health risks that are associated with that. And I think some of our other panelists might be able to speak even more to that problem. So we'll go to the next slide. Just a little bit about the financial model underlying this industry. We just tried to break down, particularly for advocates, to give them a sense of what the industry looks like in the US. Covanta and Wheelabrator operate a good portion, a sizable portion of the facilities in the country. Covanta has about 39 or 30 some odd incinerators. I think Wheelabrator has something like 15 incinerators, including the one in Hudson Falls. So they own a large market share of these facilities across the country. And most of their revenue stream comes from tipping fees from garbage hauling contracts that they have with either local municipalities, institutions, the regional waste shed where they pull garbage from. And depending on what state they're in, some facilities derive not an insignificant amount of their revenue from, sometimes up to 20% of their revenue from electricity sales, due to also having renewable portfolio standards include incineration as quote unquote a clean energy source. So they get labeled, they get this false label as renewable energy credits, and they profit from that, and that helps cushion their bottom line, certainly. But these facilities are very, very expensive to build. The last one that was built in Florida cost upwards of $600 million, tremendous capital costs, often borne by public taxpayers. And they cost a lot of money to maintain and operate, particularly as they age. So upwards of $25 million a year or more to maintain these facilities operational. So we'll go to the next slide. As I mentioned, these facilities, because they are sort of the end of their life expectancy, 31 incinerators have actually closed since the year 2000. So the trend is seeing more and more of these facilities shut down. And the shutdowns are due to a range of issues, most of them financial, that they are no longer competitive. They don't have enough secured revenue stream through their tipping fees. They can't compete in the marketplace with landfills and other waste disposal, or they don't have enough garbage volume. In other words, people get really good at recycling and composting, and they all of a sudden don't have enough garbage to burn, and so their business model collapses. They also have, as I mentioned, increasing maintenance and operation costs, and many of them facilities we saw were going back out for public financing, actually asking municipalities to tax their residents to pay for shortfalls, defaulting on public bonds, in some cases almost bankrupting cities like Detroit and Chester, Pennsylvania, because they cannot operate profitably, and the taxpayers end up footing the bill and breathing in the pollution. So it is a pretty volatile industry that is often not only putting risks, environmental and health risks on communities, but also financial risks to the host communities. And I can talk a little bit more if people are interested in sort of the the quote unquote renewable energy side of things, and how they greenwash their operations to try to secure a place in the renewable energy markets. But we also looked a little bit at the health impacts of incineration. Our report didn't go too deeply into all of the particulars because quite honestly, there's not a lot of health studies done in the US around the different health impacts associated with incineration, but we know the kinds of emissions that incinerators put out are known to be harmful to human health. And globally, there's quite a bit of data in the EU and Asia around the kinds of impacts that mercury emissions and lead emissions and dioxin emissions have on local populations. So these are not insignificant amounts of pollutants that are being put into the local environment where these facilities are located. And what's even more impactful, I think that's on the next slide, is that because these facilities are located in communities that are already overburdened with many of these communities, environmental justice communities, have a concentration of industries, have a certain level of susceptibility and vulnerability because of those socio-demographics and their lack of access to things like adequate health care. They are experiencing a cumulative burden from living with the impacts of these facilities. In addition to that, many of these facilities are not required to do continuous emissions monitoring, so they're self-reporting the emissions. And we know that even, well-functioning, quote unquote, well-functioning incinerators are putting out a significant amount of pollutants of concern, and many of them are exceeding their permit limitations and have violations. We actually looked at quite a bit of the violations and compliance history of these facilities, which does not have a good track record. And our report also took a look at the diesel trucks, the sanitation trucks, which are often a huge concern for local communities where you have hundreds of trucks, sometimes daily traversing the community and contributing to local air pollution. Go to the next slide. And just one last slide, we took a look at, we zoomed out and we also looked at how these facilities contribute to what could be already degraded air quality conditions. So this is a map of the EPA's non-attainment areas. So the EPA looks at how different regions of the country the ambient air quality looks like for specific 6 criteria air pollutants, things like particulate matter, NOx, SOx, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead. And in many of the areas that the incinerators are located, there are also areas that are in non-attainment for those air quality standards. So they are contributing to the overall degradation of the air quality in those areas. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Adrian to tell you a little bit more specifically about New York.
Okay. So we looked specifically at New York and just wanted to report back to you guys about what's happening in this state in particular. So New York has 10 incinerators, and it's actually one of the states with the most incinerators. It ties with Florida, which also has 10 incinerators. And of these 10 incinerators, we found that 7 of them are located in environmental justice communities, and we used race and income to determine the percent of the population within a 3-mile radius of these facilitators based on their race and income. So specifically for Hudson Falls, which we found is also in an environmental justice community, 38% of the population that lives within a 3-mile radius of this incinerator is low income, and about 6 or 7% are people of color. And the Hudson Falls incinerator was built in 1991 and burns about 500 tons of waste per day. And when we released the report on industry in decline, we looked at a lot of the emissions data for the specific pollutants based on the EPA emissions data that they have available on their ECHO website. And we found that actually the Hudson Falls incinerator is the worst in the nation for lead emissions in terms of their rate of emissions, and the 3rd worst for mercury. So you guys are dealing with an incinerator that's particularly dirty in terms of lead and mercury. And then we updated that, and we looked at some 2017 data and found that they emit 100 pounds of lead in 2017 and 29 pounds of mercury, and this is the worst in the state. So compared to the 10 incinerators in the state, Hudson Falls is the worst in terms of lead and mercury emissions. And then we also found that they emitted 6,000 pounds of particulate matter, which is particularly bad for humans and for cardiovascular disease, and we know has been linked to an increased risk of death from COVID-19. And we will wrap it up there, but I did want to let you all know that you can email us at tedc@newschool.edu, and you can check out our website at tishmancenter.org. But we think it's really important that, like, in addition to shutting down the incinerators and shutting down landfills, we really want to push for and advocate zero waste solutions. So this means minimizing municipal waste streams and conserving resources, and really investing in the infrastructure that we need to recover maximum resources for reuse, recycling, and composting. And if you're interested in getting involved with, the zero waste movement, we highly recommend checking out Gaia's website. And they have the zerowasteworld.org website, which is really useful. And you can see their master plan on that website. So with that, I will stop sharing and pass it back to Paul.
Thank you so much, Adrian and Anna. If it's okay with you guys, we will share your slide show and put it on our website and put it on our Facebook page. Is that okay with you guys?
Yes, you're welcome to share.
Okay, thanks so much. We now want to turn it over to after all the presentations, we'll have a question and answer segment, but I wanted to move through the presentations with some dispatch. So David, take it away.
Paul, you're asking me?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, I have difficulty hearing you. Well, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I must say I have somewhat a different perspective. I totally agree that we must move to zero waste. However, I do not agree that in general, people are recycling and composting more. In fact, they are not. Our total volume of solid waste is growing every year, and we have to do something with it. Now, what are the alternatives? I certainly agree that there's some threats from incineration. If you don't burn at high enough temperature, you get formation and release of dioxin. Dioxins and furans are some of the most potent carcinogens we know. There is clearly, as has already been stated, the potential for release of toxic metals, lead and mercury. And it is correct that the Hudson Falls incinerator releases more lead than other incinerators in New York State. Nevertheless, it's also clear that the releases from the Hudson Falls incinerator do not exceed EPA standards. Now, one can argue, and I would argue strongly, that EPA standards are not sufficient. Nevertheless, the incinerator is operating within federal standards. Now, obviously, you don't want release of dioxins, you don't want release of toxic metals, you don't want release of particulates. But every time we have a fuel-fired power plant, you're getting enormous releases of particulates. The concept of using our trash to generate energy is a good one, but it's only good provided that we can control the emissions so as to not cause harm to human health. Now, again, what are the alternatives? Our production of solid waste is increasing. There's zero debate about that. So what's the alternative to incineration? Well, it's landfills. And landfills are terribly toxic places. Landfills are almost always put in poor, minority, low-income communities. A lot of my work has been study of the health effects of people living near Superfund sites in New York State. If you live near a Superfund site, you're hospitalized more than people that do not, for diabetes, for heart disease, for respiratory disease, for thyroid disease. You have a lower average IQ, all of these things. Now, I totally agree that those are problems also of people living around incinerators. But I think that the issues around incinerators are not unique to incinerators. And it's a mistake to focus just on incinerators as posing the serious problems. The problem is we all produce too much waste. And whether it goes to a landfill or to a trash to energy incinerator, it's going to cause problems. The other problems with incinerators that certainly I acknowledge and recognize is something like 30% of what's burned becomes ash. And even if you have good controls so that the metals and the dioxins and the particulates going out of the smokestack are reduced, you have toxic ash that has to be disposed of in a landfill. So again, my own sense is that incinerators are bad, but landfills are bad. Fuel-fired power plants are bad. We are causing harm to our whole population by these facilities, which are almost always put in poor communities. And poor people are disproportionately affected, no question about that. But the issue here is that this particular incinerator meets federal standards. Now, I do agree that in my judgment, those federal standards are inadequate. Lead is a potent neurotoxin. We know about Flint. We know about now Benton Harbor. There are many communities that have lead pipes that, fortunately, if the infrastructure bill passes Congress, much will be done to replace those. The lead coming from incinerators adds to that burden. It should not add to that burden. I totally agree. But there's so many other sources of lead exposure that it's not unique to incinerators. Mercury, our biggest source of exposure to mercury, is eating fish, fish that are otherwise healthy. There are other sources of mercury in our environment. We need to be sure that the standards for what comes out of a smokestack of an incinerator does not allow release of mercury and lead and chromium and cadmium and other toxic metals in amounts that are excessive. We particularly must be sure that there's not release of dioxins and furans. A lot of my work has been with PCBs. If you try to burn PCBs, they volatilize. If you have a smokestack that doesn't capture them, they go over the area and we have increases in cancer, IQ deficits and other diseases. So it is an issue that's important with regard to incinerators, but it's not only incinerators. And my suggestion is we really need to press the federal government to be sure that the standards are sufficiently rigorous to prevent releases of these chemicals coming from incinerators. I must say, I'm not sure that I feel that incinerators are worse than landfills. The advantage of incinerators, at least you reduce the volume. But if they are releasing things from the smokestack, then they are definitely hazardous to human health. But what we put in landfills is dangerous as well. So recycling and how we deal with the recycled material, that's important. Composting, that's important. But the thing we really need to move toward is zero waste. We need to stop producing so much. A lot of it's plastic. Plastic is a very toxic material. We need to stop using plastics. We need to use biodegradable substances that are not toxic. So while I certainly support tight regulation of garbage to energy incinerators, I think that we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg of the problem of our production of solid waste and toxic materials in it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David.
we'll move on to Fred and take it away, Fred.
Okay. First, I'd like to say that I very much enjoyed the presentations by Anna, Adrian, and David, and found them very, very useful to me, just and interesting. What I'd like to talk about is sort of a larger view, and it really, in a way, takes off from what David ended with. Why is there so much garbage or waste materials produced in this country? And why is it so contaminated with a variety of toxic materials, from metals to these various organic chemicals that cause environmental damage to humans and to other parts of the environment? And basically, the reason that we have so much waste, at least one of the reasons, it's not the only one, obviously, but the major reason, in my opinion, is that we have an economic system which is geared to producing more and more stuff, where the whole purpose of the system is not to create a good environment, not to satisfy human needs, but it's to produce profits. And so in the production of profits and competition between companies, you're always trying to produce more and sell more. And there is a massive advertising, well, more than advertising, sales effort to get people to buy more and more stuff, basically. And so that part of the inherent to the waste problem is the consumerism that is really engendered by this system of production for profit, where the whole purpose of production is to produce a profit. And so there's basically the other aspect of it, one of the ways to make such profits is not to deal with the side effects. Okay, the environmental and the social side effects. In other words, let somebody else pay for those. You don't have to pay for it while you're producing whatever it is you're producing and shipping it off to some end user, some consumer. And so what that means, though, is that we pay for it in other ways. If we don't pay for it at the market or by ordering online, we're paying for it by pollution of our environment. So that this is an insidious issue, in my opinion, and really is one of the reasons behind this huge amount of waste, and also the packaging that comes with the materials is also just a part of the sales effort, and that becomes part of the waste stream also. So there is just a huge quantity of material that's being produced, and it's being produced for the purpose of making money. It's not being produced for the purpose of a healthy environment or satisfying our basic human needs. The other thing that comes from that is also the whole issue of the toxic materials that are used, whether they're in plastic or plasticizers or these PFOAs, this group of chemicals. I know that not too far away from you folks in Hoosick Falls, from Hudson Falls, there was a large contamination in Hoosick Falls of the groundwater. And we got some in Vermont, in Bennington, in North Bennington. Some of that same plume got into North Bennington with this material, which is highly, highly toxic to people and to other organisms as well. So one of the things is, if there is the way production operates and the way the companies operate and the way they make decisions, when they're making a production decision and they come up with a new chemical, they just introduce it. There's no rules or regulations that say that they have to assess it to see what its safety is like. And so there is in Europe, by the way, something that's used, which is called the Precautionary Principle, where if you don't know whether something is toxic or harmful, you don't use it. That's the precaution. You have to prove that it's not toxic, and then you can use it. Well, here it's the other way around. You don't have to prove it at all. You just go use the stuff. Some years later, could be 10, 20, 30, 40, we find out that this is a very toxic material, whether it's a metal or one of these organics. And then the companies, of course, try to delay and delay and delay and delay doing something about it, and shirking responsibility. There's a very, very interesting article in today's newspaper, today's New York Times, by the way, about this whole issue of shirking responsibility for the pollution that you cause. And this was a DuPont originally, but it's a long story, which I'm not going to get into. So you have these materials that are getting introduced into the environment because nobody is stopping them, and companies feel that they can make money by using them, that they have some advantage to make a product which they can then sell to people. So to me, the issue really comes down to, basically we have to stop or reduce the using of materials that are hard to recycle, like many plastics. Some are recyclable, some are not. We have to reduce this consumerism, this drive to just consume more and more and more. Obviously, if you're poor, you don't have the ability to consume, but you're convinced, many people are convinced by this sales effort that your self-esteem is tied up with buying some new product or getting something for your kids or whatever it is. It's going to make you happier, and you'll be keeping up with your neighbors. I would say also that the toxic materials, companies need to be forced into proving that anything that they're going to introduce into the environment, anything new that they're going to use in production, is safe. And they have to do, it may take them years to do it, well, too bad. That this is something that you can't just allow them to just go helter-skelter using whatever chemicals they want to, put them into products, and then we find out years later all this damage that's done. And these have done tremendous amount of damage to people, these various toxins. Another thing is that one of the issues with, I know sewage sludge goes into this incinerator. I guess it's not a huge volume compared to the municipal waste stream, the garbage waste stream. But sewage sludges are contaminated with toxic materials that people pour down the drains, and so many of them should not be used on farmland, okay, because of that. But if we could get the toxic materials out of the sewage sludge, the most natural thing in the world would be to recycle the nutrients back onto farmland that came from the farmland, okay? We're pouring nutrients from farmland into our cities and towns, and it's not going back. So that means they have to buy fertilizers. So it makes sense to use sewage sludge, but it has to be clean sewage sludge, and that's going to take a huge effort to do. And then I would say also that anything that can be recycled, obviously should be recycled. And anything that can be composted should be composted. We have a law that went into effect last year in Vermont, where you're not allowed to put compostable material into your, home trash for it to be picked up. And so there's a separate system developed for handling the compostable materials, and they compost it. And that obviously makes sense to do. Again, it's a soil amendment. The soils need organic matter, and this is adding organic materials to it. So it's actually helping it in some ways as well. So essentially, I guess my feeling is we need a whole different way of making decisions, and in holding businesses accountable for the decisions they make. And that we should be using the precautionary principle, as I said, as they do in Europe. We should not be encouraging people to buy more and more every year. We should not make it so easy to ship stuff across the country in packaging that then has to be dealt with later, and the pollution that occurs with the individual delivery from Amazon or from one of the other fulfillment places through a UPS or one of the other or the Postal Service, so that we're just causing pollution in many different ways by this huge amount of sales volume that goes over the internet. And then it's a question of trying to make sense of the materials that we have and use them in an environmentally sound way. And that's what I'm talking about. Recycle what can be recycled and compost what should be composted. And also consider, with, as long as we have this system in place, that maybe companies should have to cover some of the costs of this process, at this time, the companies that make the products that are causing the problems that we buy don't have to pay for any of the costs at all. It's the cost has been completely externalized onto us and to our municipalities, etc. So that's just coming at the same issue from a different angle, or slightly different angle. And I think I'll quit at that.
Thank you, Fred. So I wanted to give a chance to the panelists to comment on or ask questions of each other. So I don't trust technology tonight. I'm on edge. My shoulders are tense for the next technical glitch. So I just wanted to hear you guys talk amongst yourselves and see if you had any comments or questions of each other. So if you want, rather than using the Zoom thing, if you wanted to raise your hand the old-fashioned way, we'll take questions from you.
Yeah, I can actually, I think I heard you, Paul, say that we to encourage a conversation among us and ask questions. And I just had one point I wanted to come back to about the viability of incinerators as energy producers. And that was a subject matter that we did touch on our report and looked at extensively. And actually what we found was that waste to energy, or basically what our municipal solid waste incinerators are the most expensive form of energy production. They cost about $8 per megawatt hour as compared to nuclear at $2 or natural gas at $4. It is wildly more expensive. Very little energy, an insignificant 0.4% of our energy is derived from waste to energy. So it's an insignificant source of energy. And most importantly, it is one of the dirtiest. It's actually dirtier than bituminous coal, dirtier than natural gas in terms of CO2 per megawatt hour. So something like almost 3,000 pounds per megawatt hour compared to other energy sources. And that's because what we're burning when we burn in municipal solid waste incinerator is a whole manner of heterogeneous waste. It's actually a terrible energy source. And it's not the way we want to be producing energy. And there's nothing renewable about it, actually. The industry has inculcated themselves, tried to rebrand themselves as energy companies as a form of greenwashing. And they've done that really by claiming this thing called carbon neutrality. And they derive that rationale, that logic is based on some portion of the waste stream being biogenic. But in fact, when we look at waste audits for most of these facilities, sometimes upwards of 60% of what they're burning is non-biogenic. Actually, it's the stuff that Fred was mentioning that are in consumer products that are petroleum based. And they're not well regulated by the EPA. So even when they're within their permit limits, and they're often almost always not within their permit limits, they have exceedances into the hundreds for many of these facilities. But even when they're within their permit limits, they are self-reporting. They're not actually reporting actual emissions at their stack. And the EPA is currently under a violation of the Clean Air Act. The Sierra Club and several organizations have actually filed an intent to sue because the EPA has actually allowed for the watering down of emission standards regulating incinerators for the last decade. And so we can't trust that these facilities, especially as they age, and especially because they're in communities that have faced historic racism, right? The reason why landfills and incinerators are in these communities is because despite the fact that these are the least consumptive portions of our population. They contribute, but they're asking to bear the brunt, this consumerism of our society. And there's something about that that is really insidious. So if you ask me if I like an incinerator and a landfill, it's like asking me, do you want to die by a knife or a gunshot? I don't want to die by either. And the reality is that, unfortunately, incinerators, the reason we did the report is not to say, go to landfills, they're better. It's actually to propose a whole new way of looking at waste systems where the future is not in incineration and hopefully not in landfills either. It's in what Fred talked about, producer responsibility, going upstream, reducing our reliance on consumerism and making the polluters pay. And I think that unless we force the society, if we don't shut down the facilities that are in sacrifice zones and stop creating sacrifice zones, unfortunately, the rest of society can just shirk it and say, well, some communities are just going to get sacrificed. They're going to be our waste dumps while we continue to consume. And a perfect example of this, I grew up in New Jersey in the shadow of the state's largest garbage incinerator in the city of Newark. And the proposal in the early 1990s was to put an incinerator in every county, because that was people thought that was the solution, better than landfills, everyone gets an incinerator. But instead of everyone getting an incinerator, those wider, wealthier communities effectively fought off the siting of those facilities in their backyards. And what we ended up with was very large regional facilities in the poorest and blackest communities. And that is going to continue to happen unless we deal with the heart of the root of the problem, which is a lot of what Fred talked about. So I think there is a distributional problem. If we, as a society, decide incineration is the answer, then everyone should have an incinerator, not just the Black and brown and poor people. And that's the problem of I think it's a lot of the hypocrisy around choosing between landfills and incinerators. Because the only people who are actually being asked to choose anything, nobody's being asked to choose anything, they're actually being turned into sacrifice zones. So I just wanted to make those few points. But I would really love to explore what are the systemic solutions to these problems, right? Because I think the incinerators or landfills are really, they are dinosaurs. Incinerators are dinosaurs. No one's spending $600 million anymore on those, but are we going to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars to build the infrastructure and to change the systems that we're going to need to change to get the kind of change Fred was talking about? And that is something I would love to hear folks if they have more thoughts on that.
I would only argue that the polluters are each of us. It's not just the companies, it's that each of us, we consume too much, we waste too much, and that waste has to go somewhere. And, whether it goes to incinerator or landfill, almost always those are going to be placed in poor communities. But the responsibility really lies with each of us personally.
As much as I appreciated David's talk, I'd like to disagree with him on this. There was a very famous cartoon that Walt Kelly drew of Pogo for the first Earth Day, where Pogo is saying, he's looking out of this, garbage strewn, environment, and he's saying, we have met we have met the enemy and he is us. In other words, we're all responsible. And I would say that is really not true. And especially with regard to garbage. There was an estimate made by World Bank economists, this is some years back, but I'm sure it's pretty much the same, that approximately 60%, or is it somewhat higher? They're around 60% of the materials used in the world, of the resources used in the world, are used by the 10% of the wealthiest people in the world. Now, it's not the top 1%, but the top 10%. Okay, so that when you get down in wealth, people are not really producing a lot of waste. They're not buying a lot of products. They may want to. They may be inducements shown to try to get them to do it and to go into debt to do it. But still, so the problem with this is that there's too many people who are able to consume at a very high level. And that produces a very high percentage of the problem. It's not the whole story, but it's a very good part of the story. And so I would say that we are not the problem. It is a system that produces products for the purpose of making money, and therefore then has to push more and more and more to try to make more and more money. And those with, and also has this tremendous disparity of wealth, tremendous inequality, and the wealthy ones consume like crazy. And they are consuming, the vast amount of the resources, and therefore producing the vast amount of the garbage that we have.
Well, as you said, I don't agree with you.
Okay, no, that's okay.
I mean, I think that it's certainly true that if you have more money, maybe you produce more waste. But we all produce waste, and the very poorest among us produce waste. And there may be grades of responsibility, but I still would argue that we as the population are responsible for the enormous amount of garbage that we produce. You get garbage in poor communities just like you do in wealthy communities.
You do, but you don't get the same volume. That's the thing per person. You get a much.
Go ahead, Adrian.
Sorry, I was just going to say, not only are they not producing nearly as much waste, they're not consuming nearly as much energy or gas and driving the kinds of cars and taking the kinds of flights that they're taking. It's just so disproportionate. I'm curious if anyone in the audience has any questions, especially about the Hudson Falls incinerator too. And I'm also wondering if whatever the population's responsibility is, maybe our biggest responsibility is holding our government and producers accountable for what the crises, the ecological crises and destruction that we're currently facing as a society right now. Because what we really need to do is force our government to act. And one, we think that means shutting down things like dirty incinerators in low income and Black communities and Black and brown communities. And two, that means forcing our government to regulate the kinds of things that businesses are allowed to produce and the way they're allowed to produce them and what goes into the production of these goods. So instead of blaming not the consumer, but people, let's hold our government and these businesses, these multi-billion-dollar businesses responsible, and the fossil fuel industry responsible for this cheap, unreusable plastics that they're forcing down our throats. It's not the consumer's fault. It's the fossil fuels industry's fault. So let's shut down. I just
don't agree with that. I think you're excusing people's behavior. And granted,
I just want to go to the source of the problem.
Well, the source of the problem really is all of our use of consumables.
Oh, all right. Well, I have a good example of this. So about 20, 30 years ago, in Asia, if you went to a lot of Asian countries, Philippines, Singapore, China, there were very low levels. I mean, there's tons of historical data, very low levels of non-biogenic waste in the waste stream. And even though they had very poor sanitation infrastructure, they were able to handle a lot of their municipal solid waste locally because most of it was biogenic. About 10 years ago, the fossil fuel industry, together with giant retail consumers like Nestle, decided that there was a lot of cheap fossil fuels, that they were going to start to build an entire consumer market around plastics caches for the poor. And they called it a pro-poor policy. This was a huge multi-billion-dollar marketing effort to introduce small single-use plastics into poor economies in Asia. And they flooded their market with these plastics caches that had never before entered their waste streams, and that their waste streams were not prepared to handle. Now, these people didn't all of a sudden need little tiny packages of shampoo, but they were marketed this and pumped this was all pumped into their economy. And then when plastic started washing up on everyone's shore, the global north that made billions and profited, from Nestle down to the fossil fuel industries who were colluded to dump this stuff in the Asian countries, said, oh, you guys in Asia have a huge plastics problem. You know what you need? Build 300 incinerators. That's what you should do to solve the problem, not hey, maybe, 10 years ago, we didn't need a million shampoo bottles in a little plastic cachet. So false narratives around what's actually driving these patterns and the types of consumption that are happening around the world. And it's so insidious because it's calling it pro-poor. That's even adding insult to injury. So it is, I totally disagree that, yes, there's always a collective responsibility. I don't want to be thought of as an atomized individual, but there is always a collective responsibility. But without looking at the systems that we're sitting in and the context in which those decisions are being made, we're really missing the forest for the trees. So
okay, yes, we do have some questions from the audience. I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and ask the question myself, and then we'll get to the attendees' questions. But one is that my understanding is that both incinerators and landfills have been decreasing in numbers. Is that correct? And if nationally? If that is correct, then how is it we're handling rapidly increasing amount of waste?
we can't hear you, Paul. I'm sorry. I think I caught the first part of that, but then we couldn't hear the rest of it. I don't know if anybody else could hear it. I think you were asking about the decreasing number of landfills and incinerators, but I didn't hear the second part of the question.
I think he was saying, how is it that we're handling all of this waste if our incinerators and landfills are decreasing? Is that right, Paul? Can you give us a thumbs up or?
Oh, okay. You're good, Adrian. I could not hear that. Well, I don't know about landfills. I know the incinerators are definitely declining, right? So we have fewer and fewer because they're aging and closing down. I know that there, of course, we have a global export of waste as well. So we actually export quite a bit of waste to the global South countries. So we have a problem with exportation.
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
No.
You could chat us the questions too.
Can you hear us better now?
Yes.
Yeah, if you're close to the computer, we can hear better.
Yeah, we switched speakers. So one question from the audience is, where should individuals apply greater pressure for a greater impact, the government or corporations? And then the same person, thoughts on a circular economic model.
Well, let me, since nobody else is chiming in, I'll chime in. I think both are needed. I mean, the pressure on government and on corporations is needed to really deal with it within the context of the system that we have. And so EPA now is at least starting to get involved in some of the issues with this set of chemicals, the PFOAs that I mentioned earlier. So I think that's really you can't say one or the other, because both are needed, and corporations need to be held responsible in different ways. And so there was another part to the question which I missed. Maybe somebody else can pick up on it.
But I think you have to use government authority to get to the corporations, because the public is not going to have much energy power against corporations to force them to behave more responsibly.
I will say there's a thing called the Break Free from Plastics campaign, and that campaign is actually targeting multinational corporations directly through shareholder activism. also through public media campaigns to try to, particularly in countries where they don't have as much regulatory power as the U.S. I think in the U.S. And a lot of the global North countries, or governments to try to seek regulation and intervention. But in some of these other places around the world, looking at directly targeting some of these larger actors by going directly through shareholder and also actions on divestments, trying to reform, more producer responsibility, changing producer responsibilities in the countries of origin of some of these headquartered companies could also make a difference globally in how they act in other parts of the world.
I think one thing that people need to realize is that in the US, we export a huge amount of our trash to other poor countries. I've been most involved in e-waste. E-waste, our old cell phones, our refrigerators, our dishwashers, they go to countries in Africa, especially Ghana and Nigeria, also to Bangladesh, some to India. Until very recently, we sent all of our waste plastic to China. China no longer accepts it. It's not that the plastic is being primarily incinerated, it's being sent out of the US. It's not even being put in landfills. And this is just outrageous that we send so much of our waste to countries that have very little in the way of environmental regulation, where you have some entrepreneur that makes a lot of money by accepting it from wealthy countries. That's true in Europe also, that a lot of their solid waste, especially plastics, go to poor countries that just accept them. And of course, they handle them in a very dangerous way with no protection for their people.
Yeah. The only other thing I would add is I think what's really great about Gaia, I'm just going to throw this out there, is that they're really good helping local communities sort of fight back against incinerators, but also like, what is the alternative? And so doing composting campaigns, like getting your community to set up composting systems and to work around like what are zero waste activities or plans or campaigns that we could do locally, I think is a really good step for people who are just want to work in their community. And Gaia might be a really good resource for learning more about what can I do in my own community around waste and around shutting down this incinerator and around coming up with the alternatives now that we don't have the incinerator anymore.
One thing I just like to add about the issue of regulations, about relying on the government, is that many times the regulators are in bed with the regulated, that they really see the interests of the companies that they're supposed to be regulating as being quite legitimate, and we need to really take them more into account. And so the regulations get watered down in practice, even if they're not watered down in language, which many times they are. Many times these regulations are actually written by lobbyists for corporations so that they're tailored to be able to, these corporations be able to basically do business as usual. And so this is another reason why you need multiple pressures at the local level towards national and international corporations. We need separate avenues of attack, if you will, to this problem.
So our speaker on this end has decided to cut out. I hope you can hear me. We have another question, and it's going to have to come to the computer speaker because I can't seem to get that to work. And the question is, and you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. The question is, what are the panelists' thoughts on bioplastics and other forms of renewable packaging materials? For example, mycelium based packaging?
Well, certainly anything that's biodegradable is an enormous advance over what we have at present. Plastics are really a horrible contaminant. We've contaminated the oceans with them. Now it's very clear that even breast milk has microplastics in them. We all have them in our bodies, and it's not clear yet what the adverse health effects are. But to go to biodegradable packaging material should be a major priority.
And we have some, we actually did a conference a few years ago called Design, Justice, and Zero Waste. It was all about this, not only circularity, we had Annie Leonard there and old friends in the zero waste world with designers and products people, and many of them were experimenting with mycelium mushroom-based packaging materials, a lot of really interesting innovation in this product design space around like alternatives to petroleum-based products, and also trying to innovate how to introduce that in a way that doesn't basically drive more consumerism is true, because there's a delicate balance between creating new products and also sort of fetishizing the greening of these products with, sort of trying to, introduce alternatives that are gonna replace, the petroleum-based products. But people can learn more about that on our website. You can see some of the designs and the products that folks talked about, some of which were mycelium-based.
Trying to see. Yes. So another question is, would higher burn temperatures in the incinerator reduce lead mercury emissions? Have these?
Can't hear you, Paul.
Oh, you can't hear me. Okay. Would higher burn temperatures in the incinerators reduce lead mercury emissions?
No, in fact, they would increase it just by the temperature themselves. To reduce the emissions, you have to have control of the stack that keeps things from going out from the stack into the community. So the temperature is very important for preventing the formation of dioxins, but the metals will volatilize as the temperature increases. So the control there has to be with the scrubbers that are in the stack that prevent the metals from being emitted.
And lots of the metals end up in the ash byproduct as well. So
that's better than have them going out in the stack, but
yes,
that's absolutely true. And that ash has to be dealt with, and it usually goes to a hazardous waste site.
Yeah.
And the same person is asking, has there been testing of soil and blood levels to know if lead and mercury is elevated?
I'm assuming you mean like in the populations around incinerators. Is that what you mean?
Here and elsewhere.
Yeah, in our report, we cite some of the studies that have come mostly out of the EU and Asia around their population studies trying to correlate health outcomes with the proximity to incinerators. I don't think we included anything in our study that had direct testing that happened around incinerators. I don't think that we found that.
To David and Adrian, is the Hudson Falls incinerator?
Can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. Is the Hudson Falls incinerator an immediate and serious human health threat? How much?
Did you hear that? Is the Hudson Falls incinerator an immediate and serious? Did you guys hear the rest of that question?
I
Health
think
threat.
he was asking about if it was it's an immediate health threat.
Is that right, Paul?
That is correct. Is the Hudson Falls incinerator an immediate and serious health threat?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we're qualified to tell you whether something's an immediate health threat. I guess it depends on how you define that. It's, we tried to be very careful in our report because we're not epidemiologists and we have not studied the Hudson Falls incinerator in depth. We know that these facilities, just by the nature of the emissions that they have, are contributing pollutants to the air in that local area, but we can't say definitively like how it's impacting local health exactly, right? And it's very difficult to do that for any one facility, to say, what came out of this stack caused X or Y, because, health exposures and the pathways for health exposures are more complicated than that. People are not just breathing one thing at a time from one facility. So yeah, I don't know if we could say that definitively, that it contributes to health impacts or health risks, I think would be a fair statement, right? I don't know, Adrian, what do you?
Yeah, I think that's right.
We've done a study looking at rates of hospitalization for asthma, for respiratory infections and so forth, if you live in a zip code that has a fuel-fired power plant. So that wouldn't include the incinerators, but we found statistically significant increases in hospitalization for respiratory disease and emergency room visits for asthma attacks. There are power plants all over the place that are burning oil, natural gas, coal, whatever. So I would expect that you would find the same thing around an incinerator, although we did not study that. Anytime you're emitting elevated particulates, even independent of the metals, you're going to increase the risk of respiratory disease.
I think, one of the things, of course, is that if you don't look for it, you're not going to find it. And I guess these types of studies are not easy to do, and they're not cheap to do. And that's the only way to find out, is to actually study it.
Yeah, totally agree.
So-
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say one thing some of the local activists might want to do is like, what else is near the incinerator? Are there other industries polluting your area? And can looking at all the pollution sources in this area be part of your campaign as you move forward?
I'm using the chat.
So we have a related follow-up question coming from some of our online viewers on YouTube. And what they're interested in is, obviously there are health effects going on. There's some questions about whether or not you think the incinerator is related to the higher cancer rates in this area. But also they're asking, what can Hudson Falls residents do to help make things safer?
Well, Paul and I have been involved in a review of cancer rates in Warren County, which is this incinerators in Washington County. But there clearly are elevations in many different kinds of cancer. And it's almost certain that contaminating industries are important, even though the Department of Health likes to attribute it to the fact that people smoke and they're too fat and they don't exercise enough, which I think we both feel is totally unjustified. Other diseases have not really been investigated. We have a lot of data, but as Fred said, it's expensive and difficult to do. It would perhaps be possible to take all of the incinerators in New York State and use the state databases for hospitalization to see if people that live in some surrounding distance have more hospitalizations for, again, particularly respiratory disease, possibly also cancer, than people that don't live by an incinerator. But I suspect that the population living close to incinerators, what did you say, there's 7 or so in New York State? That population would probably be too small to really get careful, statistically significant data.
You guys might, so remember on the one slide that Anna had that looked at the non-attainment areas in terms of the air pollution that the EPA is monitoring, you guys can look at your community and see if you're in a non-attainment area for things like particulate matter and nitrous oxide and ozone and that sort of thing, to try to see like what kind of data can you collect about your area that might help you understand like what is the pollution that you're being exposed to, and what is it compared to like other surrounding communities.
Yeah, and one of the things that other environmental justice communities have actively pursued is state level regulation and oversight of incinerators. So improving the monitoring and enforcement and ratcheting down, imposing additional conditions on emissions limits. Right now, as I mentioned, the EPA is being sued to try to improve, basically tighten their emissions standards for incinerators nationally. But in New York State, you could go to the New York DEC and try to intervene when there's a permit renewal for the facility, which usually happens every few years. And that's an opening and an opportunity to weigh in and ensure that there's greater oversight and conditions put on the facility to ensure it's hopefully reducing its impact in emissions, particularly if they have high lead and mercury data.
And the only other thing I was at is like, does anyone know, and we looked at this and I just don't remember for Hudson Falls, have they exceeded any of their permit limits? Have they broken their permit rules? And has the EPA done anything to enforce it if they are breaking whatever their permitting limits are? And I don't know for Hudson Falls, but you guys can find a lot of that information on the EPA's ECHO website.
Yeah, ECHO is ECHO. So it's if you Google US EPA, and it's called Enforcement and Compliance History online, and you can see the enforcement and compliance history for all these facilities.
Great. So Paul dropped the next question in the chat, but I'm also going to read it out loud for our viewers online. The question is, does anyone know if Hudson Falls has any plans to deal with the incinerator? And if so, what are those plans?
I don't think any of us know.
I certainly don't.
Yeah, I don't either.
So there are other communities that are working to shut down their incinerator, and it might be interesting to talk to other, if you guys are asking because you're interested in like getting a campaign going, or you have it. It's hard to have this conversation because we can't see any of you. So we don't know who we're talking to. But Long Beach, there's an incinerator in Long Beach, California, where there's an environmental justice organization working really hard to shut it down, and their incinerator is their permits up for renewal. So now's a good chance. So if you got in touch with someone at Gaia, they can maybe put you in touch with other communities that are working, have campaigns going now to shut down their incinerators, and that might help. And yeah, I mean, yes, there are people all over the country who are working on this. In Detroit, there were groups who spent years working to shut down their incinerator, and they were successful. They did it. And in Baltimore, there's been a long-running campaign to shut down their incinerator and get the EPA to act on a lot of the emissions permit limits that their incinerator has been breaking and not following. So there are campaigns happening all over the country, and Gaia might be a good resource. East Yards Community Development Corporation, is that their name, Anna? Has a campaign now against their incinerator. Yeah, so there are campaigns all over the country.
Thank you for those suggestions. We have a very interesting question up next from someone here in the audience. It says, recently, Wheelabrator, with the backing of the giant international investment banks, I think it's called Macquarie, which has tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars, merged with, sorry, y'all, I dropped the card for a second. They merged with rail businesses to become Waste Win Innovations. If you look at their business plan, their goals include, quote, vertical integration. Considering that the Hudson Falls plant is on a rail line, how ominous is this for the community, especially given all the money Macquarie has to spend?
Yeah, this is happening in a lot of the incinerator business model. Is, you know, Covanta actually just was bought out by a European set of investors. Wheelabrator, they're all looking for ways to catalyze on either renewable energy markets or integration, market integration. So trying to cut costs and bring in waste from further distances. Because what's happening is that their solid waste contracts are very volatile. They used to lock in 20, 30-year solid waste contracts with municipalities or large institutions. And now, and they had these put or pay clauses where like you have to deliver a certain volume where they the facility raises the price on you or penalizes you. So you're required to deliver a certain volume of waste. Those contracts are coming to their end and they're not being renewed. People are only renewing their contracts for a year. They're negotiable. And so they're looking for ways to deliver more trash from further away. And rail is certainly an option for bringing in trash, particularly from New York City. New York City is a huge exporter of waste to upstate New York and New Jersey and other parts in the region. And they are looking to barge and rail a lot more of their waste out of transfer stations. So that is another opportunity if they could lock in those contracts. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me. And I think you all need to be attentive to the volumes of waste that are being burned, because if they're not already at capacity, often what they're doing, they're not profitable. So those facilities are always seeking to maximize their, to burn at the upper limit of their capacity and their permit. And the more you burn, the more emissions you have. So even if you're within your permit limits, if you maximize that volume of waste. So you want to be attentive to, are they asking for an expansion or an increase in their capacity to burn by bringing in more railed waste. And then they're also diversifying into waste transfer facilities. So if they have access to rail and land, they'll develop transfer facilities to send the waste to their other Wheelabrator plants.
One of the things that was interesting about one of the documents I think that Paul sent me was how far away some of the garbage, the trash is already that's coming into Hudson Falls from Westchester County, which is right just north of New York City, to places in Massachusetts, to I think there was a shipment from Quebec, plus a lot from different communities and counties in New York. So there's already quite a large, I don't know what you call it, a garbage shed for this particular incinerator. Is that the right terminology?
It's a waste shed. Garbage shed sounds better though.
Okay.
So we have kind of a related follow-up question, which is that we're interested in hearing a little bit about how greenwashing factors into international investment banks like Macquarie pushing incineration as a, quote, green technology, even though we know that it is not.
And Adrian, we can talk a little bit about when we looked at the some of the annual reporting and where the industry is spending their money. They spend a significant portion of their money on lobbying and PR. And so there is that's a big part of their business model, and mostly because they're trying to get into the renewable energy markets. They're trying to enter into the renewable portfolio standards. The incineration industry has tried for over a decade. They go every year to the State House to lobby lawmakers in Albany to be considered on par with wind and solar as a renewable energy, because they want to capture those subsidies, because of their profit margins, even a 15% change in their will put them out of business. So having a cushion in the renewable energy market and access to those. At the same time, when New York State was proposing a carbon tax or carbon fee, if incinerators came under that law, the industry was reporting that well over half of the incinerators in New York State would shut down immediately because of their carbon intensity, CO2 intensity. So if they are subject to those carbon laws, they would not survive. So it's a big deal. That's a big part of their spending because it's tied to their survival as an industry.
Apologies, y'all. I was just asking in the room if there were any more questions. We don't have any more coming in from our online chat. Would anyone present in the room like to raise their hand if they have one more question? Going once, going twice. Okay, it looks like we have asked all of our questions, and I'm going to pass it over to Paul to close us out.
All of the panelists, and if you have any websites, or if you have any links, or if you have any research that you're about to publish, we'd love to hear it now. So again, I want to thank you for coming tonight, and we stay in touch. We will post this online, live streaming, YouTube video, and so we have no other questions from our online folks, and no other questions from here in the audience. So I want to thank you guys and bid you a good night. Thanks so much.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.